Welcome to the first and more than likely last action figure history um, lesson. Yeah, this should be a disaster. Anybody that's really into, any sort of production value at all, you're going to hate this. But maybe you'll like it if you're into action figures and humor. If I can accomplish that. But without further ado, the Battle of Midway. So, the first thing to understand, at least in my opinion, about the Battle of Midway is what led up to it. How did we get there? Why is it important? We'll get into all that. How did it turn out? All that good stuff. But I think the first thing to understand is no one was really happy at all when it came to the results of Pearl Harbor. And that includes Admiral Yamamoto, pictured here, of his decadence. I mean, that's not actually him, obviously, but. And then you have the Admiral of the Mobile Strike Force of the Imperial Japanese Navy, Nagumo. Koichi Nagumo. Believe it or not, Admiral Yamamoto was not happy at all after the invasion of Pearl Harbor. So why? Well, number one, as it's well known, he wanted to take out the carriers. The fact that the carriers weren't there really wasn't Nagumo's fault, but he was roundly reprimanded anyway because, in Yamamoto's opinion, and his opinion is the only one that mattered at that particular time as it relates to um, issues in the Navy, especially that invasion, as he was the guy behind it all, so to speak, the driving force, the planner, mastermind, however you want to say it. He was pissed because Nagumo, in his opinion, and fact by the battle plan, was too what do I say, weak. He was not strong enough. He was not aggressive enough. He was not willing to do what it took, in Yamamoto's eyes, to accomplish the main goal, which was to really create as much damage as humanly possible. So Nagumo's main problem in that was he didn't authorize the third wave of the invasion, which was to take out the facilities that let me see. I think it was the fuel facilities, as well as the repair facilities, which were the main targets of the third invasion, or the third wave of the invasion. Nagumo instead opted to keep his carrier assets safe and basically waved it off after the second wave. Well, as everybody knows, there was a great deal of damage to the American fleet at Pearl Harbor. Um, Catastrophic. If the carriers had been there, then Japan might have accomplished what it set out to do, which was to accomplish what they've been able to accomplish in virtually every other engagement in their recent history, as it relates to the Navy. So, as my understanding goes, their most recent engagement, certainly, with the Russians, where they literally destroyed the Russian Navy. They forced the much larger, much more powerful geopolitical force in Russia to the negotiation table, and they were able to basically get part of Manchuria as part of that plan. Um, yeah, so I think what they were expecting to do was basically take out the United States and leave them in such a way that it was going to force them to the negotiation table. Now, as much as you can say that Yamamoto was a genius, and certainly there are lots of arguments for it, I think any thought that you were going to sneak attack the United States and force us to the negotiation table versus, I think, us being able to withstand both time and pain until we could get ours back was probably short sighted, but that's certainly the belief of the Imperial Japanese Navy, and I believe the Emperor himself was certainly behind that as well. No reason to go into the politics behind that. But yes, Yamamoto was certainly not happy with Nagumo. And, well, oh, we don't want this. There was a phone call coming in, so I had to decline that. Sorry. Let me get the camera focused back here. Oh, well. No matter. And you say, well, obviously the United States wasn't happy after Pearl Harbor either. Well, really, really unhappy. Ernest King, who was the main guy in the Navy. Why do I have him depicted like this? Well, according to all accounts, Ernest King was maybe the hardest to get along with man in all of naval history, including people that were notoriously easy to get along with. Ernest King was not about anything but kind of his own interests, and he was occasionally willing to listen to people who he thought were brilliant, but nobody except him was brilliant to Ernest King. So post Pearl Harbor, get him in focus here. Come on, you can do it. There we go. Post Pearl Harbor, you can imagine that the leadership of the United States was not doing too well at the time either. And so that meant heads needed to roll. Somebody was accountable for that absolute disaster. And who was that? Well, that was Admiral Kimmel. So Admiral Kimmel was relieved from duty. Yeah, it is not pretty. He was demoted, and he then resigned from the military shortly thereafter. So I guess one thing to note, although I don't know much about Admiral Kimmel, I can't just leave him in total shame like that because I haven't read about it yet, but it's my understanding that a naval inquiry, come on, focus, naval inquiry years later exonerated him, and yeah, he even though he died, eventually his rank was posthumously um, restored. He was a 4-star admiral. I'm going to do some more reading about Kimmel after the fact. Evidently, it was another admiral that was deemed as at fault for not letting Kimmel know about the impending invasion and whatever information they had. So, post Pearl Harbor, we needed a new leader, right? So the leader that Kimmel appointed, I mean not Kimmel, that King appointed was let me see here. Yes, it had to be a guy that could pull an absolute shitstorm together. And yeah, I think that's a pretty good depiction of a guy that could do that. So this is this is Nimitz, Chester Nimitz. So he was the guy that was deemed as the guy that was going to take over the absolute disaster that was the remainder of the U.S. Navy after Pearl Harbor. And as you can imagine, the man had an absolute disaster on his hands. But instead of coming in and cleaning house and making heads roll and doing all the things that I think some leaders would do, well, he was a man cut from a different cloth. He had, in his experience, also experienced some failure. So he was highly sensitive to that. The failure that he, early in his career, encountered was, I think he ran his ship aground. He actually went through a court martial and eventually worked his way all the way back up to admiral, and was held in such high regard that it was him that was appointed to head the Navy in the Pacific post Pearl Harbor. And there was no doubt about it. We were at war. So not only do we have to rebuild egos, ships, and everything else, but then we have to find a way to get on offense. How do we get on offense? Well, yeah, that's something that happened. So we have our first appearance of ultimately what is going to be the main weapon of this war. Believe it or not, it was, well, at least in the Pacific, it was aircraft carriers. It was the ability to bring destruction to your enemy. So in this case, the planes that I'm putting on it are way oversized, and that's on purpose because two carriers, the U.S. Enterprise, joined. I believe it was the Hornet, about yay far away from Japan. I believe they were about 700 miles away from Japan, the mainland of Japan, and about that far out, believe it or not, the Japanese had like small little fishing boats as a picket line and that was their early detection system. Well, they did pick up those carriers, despite the U.S. Navy, shooting all of them and sinking them all. It was an extraordinary amount of firepower for what ultimately was not a very fruitful um, venture there, because it took them a lot of shots to finally sink these little boats, but they finally did. But they knew they were out. They knew they were had. However, common wisdom, well, I should say naval wisdom, not common wisdom, said that, carriers got to get within 300 miles minimum to even come close to striking the mainland from aircraft carriers, given the range of the planes that would normally be on them. And that was absolutely right. However, what was on the USS Hornet at that time, where I believe it was B-26 bombers, they were the largest plane that has ever taken off from aircraft carriers. There was a whole squadron of them, led by, I think it's Colonel Doolittle. I forget his name right off the top of my head, but a very famous U.S. Army pilot. Tons of accolades, and strike back for the United States and show Japan they were not untouchable. Give them a bit of a bloody nose. This was the plan. It was approved, and yeah, the U.S. Armed Services put a lot of assets that were very valuable at the time within arm's reach, basically just to strike back. So obviously Nimitz had to be on board with that. King probably had to be on board with that. I mean, this is taking a hell of a chance, but this is swinging back. This is not, just gonna let this stuff go. So certainly, what happened was they were detected quite a ways out, and ultimately they launched a long ways out, and they were able to bomb the mainland of China, or not the mainland of China, the mainland of Japan, including Tokyo, several other cities, etc. But they knew they were going to run out of gas. And they did. Some ended up ditching in the sea, some ended up in China. But yeah, ultimately, what they showed, and Japan was not able to get any attacks off, so these carriers were able to get away. And those, the attack, although the amount of damage was probably not very much at all, it was, kind of nominal at best, in fact. But the fact that the U.S. military showed that it could hit Japan gave a whole new fire under Yamamoto to get these carriers sunk. So he literally went to diplomatic battle with the, I guess you'd say the Japanese army, because they obviously had their own interests. And they were holding off tons. They were holding a ton of assets in Manchuria. They were also fighting a land war in China. They were island hopping. They were overextended, and even though the Japanese Navy had a absolute ton of assets they could throw around to actually occupy a lot of these places, you had to get the army involved too. So there was lots of diplomatic back and forth, and that's eventually how they would come up with their battle plans. Well, they had plans already, no doubt about it, but this attack by Doolittle, called the Doolittle Raid, kind of reprioritized things. It got ultimately the Midway operation, which we'll go over here momentarily. It got it approved. But first, they had to do a little something else. The Japanese Navy already had a plan, and that was to basically cut the lifeline between the United States and Australia in a place called Port Moresby, New Guinea. It's off the coast of New Guinea, and they sent a couple carriers down there. They were gonna land some folks with some transports, but they had to do some damage first. But while they were there, they encountered something they did absolutely not expect, and that was the U.S. military in the form of, damn it, go on there, in the form of their aircraft carriers. Well, that absolutely should not be happening. So now there's some concerns. So we've got a couple of carriers there, and sure enough, out of nowhere, we have our very first carrier battle in history, where two fleets fight each other without ever having actually laid physical eyes on each other at all. They're literally fighting each other over the horizon, and it doesn't go well. It doesn't go particularly well at all for either side, because even though the United States lost, I would say, the battle ultimately, because the USS Lexington was sunk outright off the board. But also, the USS Yorktown was heavily damaged, actually thought to be sunk as well. And it had to literally trail oil all the way back to the Hawaiian Islands to get repair. But Japan did not go unscathed. No, it didn't. That's the crux of the whole thing, is their plans got screwed up. They ended up turning around the transports. Didn't work out because Japan also lost a carrier. It was sunk, and another carrier was heavily damaged, and it had to go back to Japan. And it wasn't able to take part in the upcoming battle. Well, now we're back in a situation where, okay, now this Midway plan. This was the crux of what we needed to do. All right, so Midway. How was it gonna work? What was the plan? What did they do? So, at least in the minds of the Japanese, this is the way it was gonna go. And why were they doing it? Well, they know they needed to take the carriers. So, like, why would you attack this? Way out in the middle of nowhere. It's literally halfway between the coastal United States and Japan, as depicted there on the map. The Pacific is a huge place, so obviously this is not going to be a good scale. But I'm going to go through the broad strokes of it, and you'll see. So, yeah. Well, Midway was a trap. Midway was a trap, but it was set very, very, very intricately. And it also had other issues, and it had had other parts as well. As I indicated earlier, the Navy and the Army had to kind of decide on things together. Well, you want to dedicate that much force as Yamamoto was projecting to Midway Island. Well, it's two little atolls in the middle of nowhere. To call it an island is actually uh, a joke. It's not. It's two little atolls. It's barely enough to hold what it's got. A little runway or two, some barracks, some facilities, etc. Like, what the hell would the Army want with that? Why would they want to stretch their supply lines to hold that? Well, they don't. Well, okay, but you need them too, so you're gonna have to maybe do a little carrot and stick thing. So what does the Army want? Well, the Army wants to protect, or I should say, to extend its protective barrier. It's got a protective barrier right now. It invaded Wake Island, but look at all this area out here. You got Alaska way up here, United States, so it can come all the way up here. It can attack from the north. There's problems with their protective bubble. They want to extend it. Well, they already tried going south. That didn't work out. They've already got a bunch of holdings out there. So they're not really concerned about Port Moresby. It was more of an inconvenience. The question never came up. It's like, what the hell were those carriers doing there? Probably something they should have thought about. But at any rate, yeah, back to the battle at hand. So the plan, I should say that was going south. Now, yeah, obviously going going east, that's pretty good right there. Midway, all right, but holding is going to be a pain. It's really not much of a holding. But what about north? All right, so this is ultimately what was decided on is the Army wanted to extend their protective area north if they could, as well as taking this, which kind of completes this protective bubble, so to speak. That was the plan. So how were they going to do it? So they had lots of assets they wanted to bring in. So first of all, they were going to attack the Aleutian Islands. A lot of people call this a distraction. It actually wasn't. They used a full aircraft carrier, and if you want to know what the Aleutian Islands are, it's U.S. holding in Alaska, very close to Dutch Harbor. So if you ever want to know what the weather there is like and how much of a holding that is, if you've ever seen that what is it? That crabbing show that's on the History Channel. Yeah, you'd be able to see what kind of weather we're talking about when it comes to that. So I don't know how about how great of a holding it is, but it's certainly something they wanted. So that's the way they went, and they brought a full aircraft carrier up there and a landing force. By all accounts, that was completely successful. No problems at all. It wasn't a distraction. That was them wanting to protect, or I should say, to extend their northern sort of protective bubble. And what were their plans for Midway? The plans for Midway were actually pretty interesting. Their plan, as they were going to implement it, was going to be to bring the 4 active carriers that they did have in the area. It would have been 5 or 6 have it not been for the Battle of the Coral Sea, as that's called. Their attempted taking of Port Moresby. But they're only going to bring 4 carriers and, all of their screens of light battleships, cruisers, destroyers, oilers, all that good stuff. It's not a huge area, so we're not going to put all that, stuff in there. Besides, we're going to represent that entire carrier force of 4 with just 1, just for space purposes. Then what we're going to do is we're going to put a battleship back here, but it was actually, I don't know, like 8 battleships or something ridiculous. They were holding back. They were, I don't know how many miles back from the aircraft carriers, and they were going to be there for a very specific purpose. And then, of course, you had your line of transport ships that were going to come in and actually affect the battle. So, tons of transports are represented by just one in this particular case. A bunch of battleships are being represented by just one in this case. I can't even get that one straight. So the plan was to take the mobile strike force known as the Kido Butai, and they were going to effect an aerial attack on Midway. They were going to put it out of business, at which point the transports would come in and the landing force would take over Midway effectively. They figured, well, holding that close to the United States and the Hawaiian Islands would not be acceptable for the U.S. military and leadership to take. So what they thought would happen is that the U.S. would take its remaining two carriers, by their count, would take them out, and it would take a couple of days for them to get there. And once they got there, Nagumo would take his mobile strike force, which outnumbered in both planes, but as well as number of carriers, the number of escort ships that it could have brought to bear, etc., outnumbered it handily, 4-2 by their count. However, they were also going to bring in their line of battleships to take them out. This was by Japanese doctrine known as the decisive battle. This is what they wanted to get to, where you could get the total annihilation of the U.S. Navy in the Pacific and really force the United States to the negotiation table. It would have put us in a difficult position, no doubt about it. So what actually happened, though, something different. So carriers were supposed to be there, and they were supposed to be, what Japan had plans. They had a line of carriers that arrived. A line of submarines. They brought around Hawaii a couple of days before, and they were going to keep an eye on the carriers, who, by all indications, were supposed to be in Hawaii, supposed to be in Pearl Harbor, right? They were supposed to let them know when they steamed out, and they were going to take pot shots at them the whole way, too. So they had a plan. So on the morning of the attack, 6 a.m. approximately, this whole plan went into play. Nagumo, with his force of 4 carriers, bring that out of sight, bring that slide out of sight, bring his force of 4 carriers to bear, and they attack Midway. Now, they thought Midway was just going to be, maybe a handful of troops, maybe some, light anti-aircraft. Certainly no ships or anything around. But ended up that, they were a little bit more enforced than anybody thought. And furthermore, when they got there, so they ran into more hellish anti-aircraft gunfire than they thought, and that did some damage. I think approximately 15 to 20% of the squadron that was sent was either destroyed or damaged by the time it returned to the carriers. Believe the pilots also reported that the anti-aircraft was far more hellish than they expected. However, they did a fair amount of damage. However, I'll say those are dead. However, it wasn't over. Upon return, well, I should say upon completion of that wave, and not unexpected given Japan's experience in the battle and the war up to that point, he recommended the leader of that squadron recommended a second attack on Midway. So, okay. All right. So, fine. Nagumo now has to figure that out. Well, he's got half of his planes in reserve. Well, that was an order. So what he wanted to do was, all right, so we've got to do a second. Let's go ahead and that reserve force, which was really in place in case by some miracle, the U.S. military was there with any sort of with any sort of surface presence, like battleships or carriers or cruisers, destroyers, anything in the area. So those would be the biggest threats from where they were attacking. That's what they thought the biggest threats were. So, yeah, made sense, made all the sense in the world. So, what they wanted to do was okay. Nagomo said, oh, "Go ahead and rearm the backup force, and let's go ahead and attack Midway again." And yeah, so they started preparing for that, which was not unheard of. He's basically within doctrine at this point. And then out of nowhere, this completely unexpected thing happened. They got it was noteworthy to the pilots that there were some problems for sure with the attack on Midway. They had to do it again, but there were no planes there. Well, about that time is when they started receiving those planes from Midway in the form of attacks. Everything from glide attacks from SBDs to old marine planes. Yeah, those were not to be unexpected at all, and well, they weren't. But yeah, there was also some bombers. These bombers were coming in at such high altitude that when they dropped their bombs, the carriers literally had time to look up, see their flight path, and turn. So there was no success from any of the land-based carriers, the land-based aircraft that came to attack from Midway. However, that did delay the ability to do anything but land and rearm and basically have the air patrol. So you're talking Zeros, fighters that are coming on and off. And carriers can only do one thing at a time. At least the Japanese carriers back then, they could either land the planes or they could stage the planes to take off. They couldn't do two things at a time the way that they were set up. So it's going to take time. So, oh geez, well, but now we're rearming and we're getting these attacks. They're kind of piecemeal. They're small. They're easy to fend off. The Zeros are tearing the slow American fighters and slow American bombers to pieces. It's a joke. The torpedoes get nowhere close to the carriers. They are unscathed. And now they're kind of pissed too. So they're preparing that second wave, and then other planes just kind of keep showing up, but these planes are looking a little bit different. They're starting to look like, they're not from Midway. They're coming from weird angles, and it starts to become clear, not only from these attacks, but also from a sighting of some search planes they sent out really to prove a negative. They were out to prove a negative that there was no surface ships in the area to engage at all. But that was sort of the problem. Okay. So where were they? Well, they got no contacts. The subs got no contacts because the ships had left days earlier. And where were they? they were there. How many of them were there? There was three. So, yeah. The Yorktown went all the way back to Pearl Harbor. It received its repairs literally in days. It re embarked out to Midway to take part in this mission, um, with mechanics still on board, still patching up the holes, still trying to get the critical systems working. Um, and they were able to do it. Mechanics still on board. They steamed out with the Enterprise and the Hornet, and they were already north of Midway Island by the time that the Japanese got there. And before they knew it, between the sighting from the Tone search plane, which there's some unique stories around that, like how did they see him one time and not see him another? Searches were, yeah, like I said, I think they were out to prove a negative, and so they didn't really try too hard. But there was no reason to try hard. But why were they there? Well, they were there because part of the holdover that Nimitz took on was, I guess, kind of an egghead guy by the name of Joseph Rocheford. Don't know much about him yet. I want to read his, not Joseph Rocheford, but this is Edwin Layton. Edwin Layton. He was an intelligence officer prior to Pearl Harbor, actually. So he could have easily been fired, been considered a total disgrace. But, like I said, Nimitz made decisions. He decided that, yeah, Layton had to stay. And furthermore, the more he listened to Layton, the more that he thought, well, maybe this guy's onto something. And there was one thing that he was onto in particular, and that's the fact that one of his colleagues was beginning to break the Japanese imperial code. And in doing so, they were coming up with some information that might be extremely helpful to Nimitz. So now we enter Joseph Rocheford. So Joseph Rocheford was, and as you can tell, he's kind of depicted as a little different. Yeah, by all means, my man was not your average everyday intelligence officer, human being, military personnel. No matter what you want to say, he was different. However, gifted such that he actually took a series of musicians from the different battleships, and he put together a code breaking team, and somehow, some way, through some miracle, through whatever gifts that probably bordered on autism for all we know, yeah, he was able to decipher enough of the Japanese code, and then they were able to confirm that he was correct to the point where even Ernest King himself agreed that, yeah, they were going to attack Midway. So, yeah, Nimitz had a plan.